I guess let's just get into the first one. We've all heard this as Bitcoiners is Bitcoin is a bubble. How do you think is the best way to kind of address this concern?
A lot of that's understandable because people look at the linear chart, and so you just see basically, if you look at the linear chart, you see kind of Bitcoin like a flat line that looks near zero, and then it spikes all the way up to 20,000, then collapses, and then has this big consolidation. And until the last several months, when it came up and retested those highs, it looked like it was never going to get back to that previous bubble high. Now, this simple fix, for anyone listening, look at it in log form first of all, and then also draw the halving points on that log chart, and then you'll see basically this like rhythmic algorithmic increase in price that looks a lot different than it looks like on that linear chart. And so I think that's probably the best answer to look at that and to show that really the bubble in 2017 was not really any different to the prior peaks in previous halving or launch cycles, and it kind of goes through that same kind of cycle every 4 years. And the only reason that one stood out is because that's the most recent. And so on a hugely exponential chart like Bitcoin's price, that's the only one that's visible on a linear chart. And that's the only one that really caught the broad media attention, whereas the first two happened when Bitcoin was a much smaller asset. So I would just implore people to look at the log chart, look at the halving points, and then make up their mind from there, whether it's a more rhythmic increase or an actual bubble. I mean, you can argue that it's a local bubble, but it's not like the super bubble that many people, say it is.
So you brought up the halving several times, and you instructed people to actually layer out the halvings on the log chart. Um, what's your opinion on the halving? The halving is something that causes a lot of debate in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency community. Like, does it depict what's happening in the future? Does how where does human action come into that? Like, how can this thing be programmably going up in value? Can you kind of give some comments on that?
Yeah, so I think it's extraordinarily well designed protocol. And it's interesting because it could have been that the first person who invented cryptocurrency, could have invented all those hard parts. But then when it goes to designing details of the protocol, he could have done something totally different, and it just doesn't work out as well. So it's actually really interesting that, the other details, like, a halving cycle or the difficulty adjustments, all those kind of details kind of work together so well. And I think that's one of the things you find out about Bitcoin as you learn more and more about it. And so with the halving cycle, basically what it does is it breaks the supply demand equilibrium that starts to exist in the several years, after the previous halving. So eventually, Bitcoin has this thing, after halving, it tends to have a pretty strong bull market in the next, year or 2 years. It has generally a blow off top, and then it has a crash and a period of consolidation, and it eventually kind of finds an equilibrium. And just when it does that, the new supply gets cut in half, and that just throws a wrench into the equilibrium that just developed. And of course, that's, it's well telegraphed in advance. I mean, people know, they're not surprised by the halving; they know it's coming. But it's not until several months after halving that those liquidity issues start showing up, where some percentage of people are buying and holding, and there's only a certain percentage they're willing to sell at that price. Eventually, that supply reduction drains liquidity out, and just like any commodity, really, you start to get a supply demand imbalance, and you start to see price appreciation until some of the cold storage like hodlers are willing to part with some of their coins and kind of bank some profits.
Yep, everyone has their price at some point. And it's kind of incredible, like seeing this process go out a second time, at least for me, just because it seems like it's something that's programmed, but then you like it can't be that programmed in. So it's just interesting seeing it again. But we'll see next year if it really does kind of fully pan out. I do want to jump to the next question. So again, this is a very common misconception. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. Gold can be used in jewelry. It can be used in electronics and industrial uses. You know, Bitcoin, it's just information, has no industrial or no intrinsic value. What's your response to that misconception?
Yeah, sure. I'll briefly touch on the last point just to finish it off. So I also, when I talk about Bitcoin, I like speaking in terms of probabilities. And so, I can never guarantee what the price is going to be like in any given halving cycle, what's going to happen next year, what's going to happen 4 years from now. But basically, so far that halving cycle's played out pretty well. And in addition to it actually having played out, the logic of why it plays out makes sense. And so when I speak of, the halving cycle, I say, okay, this is my base case for what's going to happen in the future. I consider it more surprising for certain, outcomes to not happen, right? So it's kind of all about probability. And that's actually one of the things I'm watching is to see, when will Bitcoin eventually have a halving cycle that say doesn't work out the way that the pattern did. I think that that could change some perceptions about it. But in the meantime, to the extent that that pattern remains algorithmic, it's something to keep watching, and it's just a really fascinating outcome. And you can just kind of align probabilities around it. And then so as far as Bitcoin's intrinsic value, that was one of the shorter sections of my article because that was a deep dive I did in my first Bitcoin article. And so I mostly referenced back to that one, but I still wanted to have that addressed because I know people that not have read the first article will bring that up. And so what I really focus on is the network effect and the scarcity. And so Bitcoin's intrinsic value is that it's essentially a store of value that is highly portable and has many of the properties of money and saving, in a way that is kind of like gold in some ways better, right? Especially the portability aspect of it. And so, uh, one of the hangups I had back in 2017 was that even if Bitcoin is has some value, what about the fact that there's so many other altcoins coming along? Like, couldn't this whole marketplace be heavily diluted? And even if say $1 trillion comes into the space, what if it divides equally among the top 10 protocols? And you just kind of have that diffusion of capital. And so my emphasis was on the network effect that Bitcoin has. So it's kind of like how anyone can create a social network, but have fun trying to compete with Facebook that already has the self-reinforcing feedback loop of already having a ton of users. And so, it's sometimes it's possible to create a new one. It's just extraordinarily difficult. And the ones that generally have that network effect are really hard to dethrone. And you can go down to any sort of protocol, like even not a company, just a protocol that becomes kind of commonplace, in the programming world or in the tech world. Once something achieves enough adoption, even if something comes along that in theory is better, it ends up being worse just because no one uses it, and therefore it's not as good as the one that's already kind of widely distributed and self-reinforcing. And so that's how I view Bitcoin, is essentially analyzing it in a similar way you'd view any other network.